The dominion of Thalkarath had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no species had ever refused to kneel before them. Not the insectoid Vryn with their hive armies, not the silicon-born Drakeel with their living warships, not even the pale mothers of Ythra, who had once controlled an entire nebula. Every single one of them had broken, surrendered, and accepted the chains of the Dominion without exception. That was the way of the galaxy, and High Imperator Zorath Kale believed it would always be so. He stood in the war chamber of the Obsidian Halls, a room carved from a single piece of volcanic glass that stretched higher than most buildings on lesser worlds. His forearms were folded behind his back, and his pale gray eyes moved slowly across the star map that floated before him like a cloud of burning jewels. Each jewel a system that belonged to him, each light a world that had learned obedience. "There," said Fleet Admiral Vistorian, pointing one long clawed finger toward a dim yellow star on the edge of the map. "Our deep space probes picked up electromagnetic signals from the third planet orbiting this star. The signals are primitive, radio waves, fragmented data bursts, and something that appears to be entertainment broadcasts." Kale tilted his massive head and let out a low rumble that passed for amusement among his kind. A species still using radio waves was barely worth the fuel it would cost to reach them. "How primitive are they?" he asked. "They have not yet left their own star system in any meaningful way," Torin answered, pulling up the probe data so it shimmered in the air between them. "They appear to have basic settlements on their moon and the fourth planet of their system, but nothing beyond that. No FTL capability, no energy shields, no plasma weaponry. By our classification standards, they are a Category 2 civilization at best." Kale almost laughed. Category 2 was the lowest tier worth conquering. Anything below that was simply bacteria. "Send the 9th expansion fleet," he said without hesitation. "Standard subjugation protocol. I want that system under our flag within one rotation." But before Torayan could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and every light in the war chamber flickered, once, then twice, then went dark for exactly 3 heartbeats before returning, and every officer in the room went silent, because they all knew what that meant. The Oracle was waking. Deep beneath the obsidian halls, in a chamber that no living Thalkarath had built, there existed a being that was neither fully alive nor fully machine. The Oracle was a fusion of silicon and carbon, grown rather than constructed, and it had been the guiding mind of the Dominion since before recorded history. It spoke rarely, and when it did, empires listened. The crystal walls of the Oracle chamber began to glow as Kale and his officers descended the ancient stairs. The air grew cold, and there was a smell like burning metal and rain, the Oracle's way of announcing that it had something to say. The massive crystalline structure at the center of the chamber pulsed with light, and for the first time in living memory, the color it produced was not the calm blue of guidance or the amber of caution. It was a deep, violent red that none of them had ever seen before. And then it spoke, its voice filling the chamber like thunder rolling through water. "Turn your fleets from the third world of the yellow sun. The two-legged storm sleeps there. They are not prey. They are not cattle. They are the wound the universe gave itself to remember pain. Do not wake them." Silence filled the room like a physical weight. Kale stared at the Oracle, and for just one moment, something cold moved through his chest. But he crushed it quickly, because fear was not something a High Imperator was permitted to feel. "The Oracle speaks in poetry," Kale said, turning to his officers with a forced calm that fooled most of them. "It has done this before. As it ages, its predictions grow less precise and more dramatic. This is not a warning. It is a malfunction." But not everyone was convinced. In the back of the chamber, standing apart from the military officers, was Calvret Sohn, the first scholar of the Dominion, a thin, quiet male with eyes that missed nothing and a mind that never stopped working. He had studied the oracle his entire life, and he had never once seen it produce that color. He had never once heard it sound afraid. Calvret said nothing in the chamber, because speaking against the Imperator in public was a quick way to lose one's head. But as soon as he returned to his private study, he began pulling every piece of data the probes had gathered about the yellow star system and its inhabitants. What he found made his blood run cold. The two-legged creatures called themselves humans, and they lived on a world they called Earth, a small blue-green planet with a single moon. They were soft-bodied, fragile by galactic standards, with no natural armor, no claws worth mentioning, no venom, and no ability to survive in vacuum. By every biological measure, they should have been prey animals. But the data told a different story. Their planet's history was soaked in blood, not the blood of alien invaders, not the blood of predators, but their own. They had fought wars against each other for their entire existence, thousands and thousands of wars, over land, over resources, over ideas, over things so abstract that the translation software could barely process them. They had killed over 1 billion of their own kind in organized armed conflict, and had somehow not only survived, but thrived. Calvret read about their world wars and felt his hands begin to shake. He read about their nuclear weapons, devices they had invented and then immediately pointed at each other. And he had to stop and walk around his study just to calm down. These creatures had split the atom, and their first thought had been to weaponize it against themselves. Still alive, still building, still reaching for the stars with bloody hands and unbroken spirits. He tried to send a message to the Ninth Fleet, a private warning to Commander Torain, begging her to reconsider, but it was rejected. The fleet was already in FTL transit, 4,000 warships carrying 2 million soldiers toward a world they believed would fall in hours. Calvret sat alone in his study, surrounded by scrolling data about human history, human warfare, human art, and human fury, and he understood something that the Imperator and the fleet and the entire Dominion did not yet understand. The Oracle had not malfunctioned. It had been terrified. And somewhere in the cold silence of his study, the translation software finally finished processing the last batch of intercepted human transmissions. A category it had labeled war poetry, and Calvret read the words of a long-dead human who had written about battle, and about rage, and about the passing refusal to go quietly into the dark. He closed the file and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. Then he whispered to himself in the empty room, "What have we done?" Far away, across the black void of space, the Ninth Expansion Fleet hurtled toward Earth at faster-than-light speed, and 4,000 warships hummed with the quiet confidence of a predator approaching what it believed was easy prey. And back in the obsidian halls, in its ancient chamber, the Oracle spoke one final time to no one at all, its red light flickering in the darkness like a dying heartbeat. "I have shown you mercy by showing you fear. You have mistaken it for weakness. Remember that, at the end." No one heard it. No one was listening. The Ninth Expansion Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel just beyond the orbit of Neptune, and Commander Torain stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Burning Throne, watching the yellow star grow brighter through the observation screen. It was a small and unremarkable sun, the kind that barely deserved a name in Dominion star charts, and the tiny blue world orbiting it looked fragile enough to crush between her claws. She expected silence from the system. Every primitive species they had ever encountered needed days or even weeks to notice an alien fleet in their territory. But the humans noticed in minutes. "Commander," said her sensor officer, his voice carrying an edge of confusion that Torain did not like. "We are being scanned. Multiple focus sensor beams have locked onto the fleet from at least 9 separate points across this system. The sources include the third planet its moon, the fourth planet, and several objects in the asteroid belt. Toren blinked all four of her eyes in sequence, which was the Thalkarath equivalent of a frown. A Category 2 civilization should not have had the ability to detect them so quickly, let alone from multiple locations simultaneously. It suggested a level of coordination and awareness that did not match the probe data. "It changes nothing," she said firmly. "Broadcast the standard subjugation message on all frequencies." The message went out, a simple demand, transmitted in the mathematical language that every species could understand. Surrender your biological and territorial sovereignty to the dominion of Thalkarath, or face total annihilation. It was a message that had been sent thousands of times to thousands of worlds, and the response was always the same: confusion, panic, desperate attempts at negotiation, and eventually surrender. The response from Earth came in 11 minutes, and it was none of those things. The transmission arrived in over 7,000 languages simultaneously, a fact that by itself made the communications officers exchange worried glances, because it meant the humans had not one language, but thousands, and they had somehow coordinated a unified response in all of them at the same time. The message was 3 words long: "Identify yourselves, now." There was no fear in the transmission. There was no awe, no panic, no pleading. There was just a cold and flat demand, spoken in the tone of a species that was not afraid of what had arrived in its sky, but was instead deciding whether or not to be angry about it. Torean felt something move in her chest that she refused to name. She crushed it the way she had been trained to crush doubt, and turned to her weapons officer. "Fire a demonstration volley at the uninhabited moon of the 6th planet," she ordered. "Show them what they are dealing with." The Burning Throne's main batteries spoke, and a small frozen moon that had existed for 4 billion years was turned into a cloud of expanding gas and rock in less than 3 seconds. The flash was visible across the entire system, a message written in fire that said, "This is what we can do. Imagine what happens if you refuse." And then Earth went silent. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3, and Torean allowed herself to relax. This was the pattern she knew, the silence of a species coming to terms with its own helplessness, the quiet despair of a world realizing that the universe was larger and more dangerous than it had ever imagined. Soon, the surrender would come, along with the tears and the begging, and the Ninth Fleet would add another system to the Dominion's map. At the 4-hour mark, her sensor officer made a sound that Torrend had never heard him make before. A choked, strangled noise that was somewhere between a gasp and a scream. "Commander," he said, and his voice was shaking, "I am detecting launches, thousands of launches, from the 3rd planet, its moon, and the 4th planet simultaneously." "Thousands?" Torrend repeated, certain she had misheard. "Confirmed. Over 12,000 individual objects on intercept trajectories with the fleet. They are small, fast, and accelerating beyond anything our models predicted for this civilization's technology level." Torrane stared at the tactical display and watched as a wall of red dots swarmed outward from the inner system like a cloud of angry insects. The humans had spent their 4 hours of silence not in despair, not in terror, not in the slow acceptance of defeat. They had spent it mobilizing. Every factory, every military base, every orbital platform, every single asset they had pointed it all at the Dominion fleet and fired everything. Then the communications array crackled, and a new transmission came through from the human moon, from a place the humans called Tycho Crater, and the voice that spoke was female, calm, and absolutely without mercy. "This is General Lena Vasquez of the United Earth Defense Council. You just destroyed something that did not belong to you, and on Earth, that is called an act of war. We have been practicing for war since before your species learned to walk upright. You have one chance to withdraw. There will not be a second. Torrain's tactical officer was already running calculations on the incoming objects, and when the results came back, his face went pale beneath his gray scales. "Commander, those objects are not drones. They are missiles. They appear to be nuclear-tipped kinetic weapons, fired in such volume that our point defense systems cannot intercept them all. They are using a strategy of sheer numerical saturation." "That is insane," Torrain said. "No rational species wastes resources on that scale." Her tactical officer replied, "The humans do not appear to be operating on a model of rational resource management," and there was genuine fear in his voice now. The first wave of missiles hit the outer screen of the fleet, and 3 Dominion warships, vessels that had survived 100 battles across 40 star systems, vanished in blooms of nuclear fire that lit up the void like new stars being born. The bridge of the burning throne shook, and alarms began screaming, and Torrain gripped the arms of her command chair as the reality of the situation crashed over her like a wave of freezing water. The Ninth Fleet had just taken casualties, real casualties, from a species that was not even supposed to have the technology to scratch their shields. "All ships, battle formation," she roared. "Engage the incoming weapons, and prepare for close combat." But even as she gave the order, her intelligence officer was pulling up the intercepted data from the human world, scrolling through their history at desperate speed, searching for anything that would explain how a species this primitive could fight like this. And what he found turned his stomach. The humans had a recorded history of roughly 10,000 years, and in that time they had fought each other in over 15,000 documented wars. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire world, not once, but many times over. And instead of using those weapons to end themselves, they had simply added them to their arsenal and kept fighting. They had sent members of their own species to die in numbers so vast that the translator software struggled to display them, and the survivors had gone home, buried their dead, and started building again. They called it resilience. And now, for the first time in their existence, they were not fighting each other. They were fighting a common enemy. And every 1,000 years of practice, every war, every battle, every drop of blood they had ever spilled against their own kind, had prepared them for exactly this moment. The second wave of missiles arrived, and 5 more Dominion ships died. Then the third wave came, and with it something new. Small, fast human ships that darted between the missiles like fish swimming alongside sharks. Ships so tiny that the Dominion targeting systems kept dismissing them as debris. Those tiny ships carried boarding teams, and when the first human soldiers cut their way through the hull of a Dominion cruiser and stepped inside, armored in crude but effective metal suits, and carrying weapons that fired solid projectiles at terrifying speed, the Dominion soldiers who met them in the corridors learned something that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The humans were smiling. They were grinning behind their helmets as they fought, moving through the narrow corridors with a speed and aggression that the Dominion's tall, ranged combat soldiers could not match. They fought with guns and blades and fists and teeth, and when their weapons ran dry, they picked up Dominion weapons and figured out how to use them in seconds. In the darkness of a burning corridor, a Dominion soldier looked into the eyes of a human who had just killed 3 of his squad mates with a metal pipe, and he saw something that made him drop his weapon and run. Not anger, not hatred, not madness, but joy, pure and terrible joy. The joy of a predator that had finally found something worth hunting. On the bridge of the burning throne, Commander Torrain watched her fleet begin to die, and she finally understood what the Oracle had tried to tell them. These creatures had not been hiding in their little blue world out of weakness. They had been sharpening themselves, and now the blade was drawn. Calvreth Sohn had not slept in 3 days, and his hands had not stopped shaking since the first casualty reports came in from the Sol system. He sat in his private study on Thalkarath, thousands of light years from the battle, watching the data scroll across his screens in real time through the Dominion's quantum link network. And every number he saw made the cold in his chest grow deeper. The Ninth Fleet was dying. Not slowly, not gracefully, not in the orderly retreat that the Dominion's military doctrine prescribed for unfavorable engagements. It was being torn apart by a species that should not have been able to scratch its paint, and the manner in which it was happening defied every model of warfare that the Dominion had developed over 12,000 years of galactic conquest. The humans did not fight the way other species fought. Every civilization the Dominion had ever encountered followed the same basic pattern when attacked. They formed defensive lines around their homeworld. They concentrated their forces. They tried to create a shield between the enemy and their population centers, and they held that shield until it broke. It was logical, predictable, and it always ended the same way. The humans did none of this. Instead of defending, they attacked, not from one direction, but from every direction simultaneously, pouring out of the inner system like a swarm that had no center and no edge. Their ships came from behind asteroids, from inside dust clouds, from orbits that made no tactical sense until the moment they suddenly made perfect sense. They used the gravity of planets and moons to slingshot their vessels at impossible speeds, turning the very geography of their star system into a weapon. Calvreth watched a group of human ships lure a Dominion destroyer squadron into the asteroid belt, and then systematically collapse the asteroids around them, using mining charges to create a cage of tumbling rock that crushed 3 warships without firing a single conventional weapon. He watched human pilots fly their damaged fighters directly into the engine arrays of Dominion cruisers, detonating on impact. And the fleet records showed that at least one of those pilots was laughing on her communication channel in the final seconds before she hit. He watched the boarding actions, and those were the worst of all. The Dominion soldiers were bred for ranged combat. They were tall, long-limbed, and precise with energy weapons at distance, but the corridors of a warship were tight and close, and in those spaces the humans were nightmares made flesh. They moved with a speed and violence that the Dominion's battle AI could not predict, because the AI operated on models of rational behavior. And the humans were not being rational, they were being something else entirely, something the AI had no category for. One Dominion officer's report, transmitted in a shaking voice before his ship went dark, described a human soldier who had been shot twice through the torso and continued fighting for another 4 minutes before finally collapsing. And even then, the human had used his last breath to pull the pin on an explosive device strapped to his chest. "They do not stop," the officer had said, his voice breaking apart like glass. "They take damage that should kill them, and they keep moving. They lose limbs, and they keep fighting." I watched one of them hold a corridor alone against 12 of our soldiers for 9 minutes with a broken arm and a weapon that was running out of ammunition. And when the weapon was empty, the human threw it at us and charged with a knife. What are these things? What are they? Calvreth knew what they were. He had spent his entire career studying alien species, and he had finally found one that truly terrified him. Not because they were strong, not because they were technologically advanced, not because they had some secret biological weapon hidden in their soft and fragile bodies, but because they simply refused to accept defeat under any circumstances, and that refusal was not a strategy or a tactic. It was something woven into the very core of what they were. They had a word for it in one of their many languages, stubbornness. But that word was far too small for what Calvreth was watching. The turning point of the battle came on the 4th day, when the humans did something that should have been impossible. A group of human technicians, not soldiers, not military engineers, but civilian computer specialists working from portable machines on the surface of Earth, broke into the Dominion's encrypted fleet communication network. The encryption was quantum-layered, designed by the greatest minds the Dominion had ever produced, and it had never been breached in 12,000 years of use. And a collection of humans sitting in what appeared to be a university building cracked it in 72 hours. Calvreth stared at the report and read it 3 times because he could not believe it. The humans had intercepted Dominion communications during the opening hours of the battle, and instead of being baffled by an alien technology they had never seen before, they had treated it as a puzzle, a challenge, a game, and they had solved it with a combination of mathematical brilliance and what could only be described as creative insanity. They did not just break the encryption, they turned it against the fleet, feeding false orders into the communication network, rerouting supply coordinates, scrambling targeting data, and within hours, the Ninth Fleet was blind. Ships that had fought together for decades could no longer coordinate. Squadrons broke apart in confusion. Friendly fire incidents erupted across the battle space as Dominion vessels fired on each other based on corrupted identification signals. And while the fleet stumbled in the dark, the humans pressed their attack with everything they had left. General Vasquez directed the battle from her command center beneath the lunar surface, and Calvreth could track her orders through the intercepted human communications. She was calm, precise, and utterly ruthless in a way that reminded him of the great Dominion commanders of old. She moved her forces like pieces on a game board, sacrificing ships to draw Dominion vessels into traps, using the wreckage of destroyed vessels as cover for ambush attacks, and always pushing forward. She never gave a single order to retreat. The word did not appear in any of her communications, not once, across the entire battle. And then came the moment that Calvreth would remember for the rest of his life, the moment that told him, with absolute certainty, that the galaxy had changed forever. A human destroyer, badly damaged and burning, its crew reduced to a handful of survivors, positioned itself directly in the path of a Dominion dreadnought that was making a run toward Earth. The destroyer had no weapons left, no shields, no engines capable of escape. It was a dead ship, crewed by people who knew they were about to die. They did not move. They did not call for help. They did not transmit a surrender. Instead, the captain of that tiny broken ship opened a channel to the dreadnought and said 6 words that would be carved into memorials across 100 worlds in the years to come. You do not pass through us. And then the destroyer fired its reactor core directly into the dreadnought's forward shields, and both ships vanished in a flash of light that was visible from the surface of Earth. Calvreth covered his face with his hands and wept, because he finally understood the Oracle's warning in its fullest and most terrible meaning. The humans were not dangerous because they were strong. They were dangerous because they had spent 200,000 years trapped on a single world, fighting and dying and surviving against themselves. And all of that suffering had forged them into something that the galaxy had never seen before. They were not soldiers. They were not conquerors. They were not warriors in the way that Dominion understood the word. They were survivors, the most stubborn, creative, furious, and unbreakable survivors the universe had ever produced. And they had been waiting for this fight their entire existence without even knowing it. When Commander Torayan finally gave the retreat order from the burning bridge of the burning throne, her voice was flat and empty, stripped of all pride and authority. Of the 4,000 warships she had brought to the Sol system, only 612 were still capable of faster-than-light travel. The rest were debris, scattered across the system like the bones of a dead beast. Her final transmission to Dominion Command was short. The Oracle was right. May it forgive us. And far away, on a blue-green world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, a species of soft-bodied, short-lived, impossibly stubborn creatures looked up at a sky that was finally clear of enemies and did not celebrate. Every species the Dominion had ever conquered followed the same pattern after surviving an invasion. They hid. They dug deeper into their worlds. They built higher walls. They turned inward and prayed that the darkness between the stars would not come for them again. Fear was the natural response to discovering that the universe was full of teeth, and every rational civilization chose safety over risk once it had tasted the reality of galactic war. The humans did not hide. 6 months after the Battle of Sol, the wreckage of Dominion warships still drifted in orbit around Earth and its neighboring planets. But the humans were not mourning their dead or trembling at what had come for them. They were working. And the speed at which they worked frightened Calvreth more than the battle itself had. Human engineers had pulled Dominion FTL drives from the shattered hulks of destroyed warships and brought them down to their surface in pieces. Teams of scientists, mechanics, and what the humans called enthusiasts, ordinary citizens who simply found the technology fascinating, had begun disassembling, studying, and rebuilding those drives in laboratories, garages, and university workshops across the planet. Within 3 weeks, they understood the basic principles. Within 5 weeks, they had built a working prototype. Within 8 weeks, they had not only replicated the Dominion's faster-than-light technology, they had improved it. Calvreth read the intelligence reports from Dominion spies who had been monitoring human communications, and he felt something beyond fear. He felt awe mixed with a deep and terrible sadness, because he realized that the humans were not geniuses in the way the Dominion understood genius. They were something far more dangerous. They were a species that treated every problem, every obstacle, every impossible challenge as a personal insult that demanded an answer. And they would not rest until they had one. The Dominion had spent 800 years developing its FTL technology. The humans had reverse-engineered and surpassed it in 2 months. And then they did the one thing that no conquered or attacked species had ever done in the entire history of the Dominion. They followed. The United Earth Expeditionary Force, a fleet of human-built ships carrying Dominion-derived FTL drives and armed with a terrifying combination of human and alien weapons, launched from Earth's orbit and jumped into Dominion space. It was not a large fleet by Dominion standards, perhaps 300 ships, but every single one of them was crewed by volunteers who had watched an alien armada try to enslave their world, and had decided that the correct response was not to cower, but to go knock on the enemy's door. But they did not go to Dominion worlds first. They went to the worlds that Dominion had conquered. The first world they reached was Vryn Prime, homeworld of the insectoid Vryn, a species that had lived under Dominion control for 9,000 years. The Vryn had forgotten what freedom tasted like. Their queens were dead, their soldiers were bred to serve Dominion officers, and their culture had been reduced to a set of work schedules and production quotas. The human fleet arrived in orbit and broadcast a message that was translated into every language the Dominion used. This is the United Earth Expeditionary Force. You are not alone anymore. If you want to fight, we will fight beside you. If you want to be free, we will open the door. The only thing we ask is that you never enslave another living thing. The Vryn did not respond for almost a full day, and the humans waited patiently, because they understood something that the Dominion never had. That a people who have been in chains for 9,000 years need a moment to remember what it means to stand up. When the Vryn finally answered, it was a single word, transmitted from a hidden underground chamber where the last free-thinking Vryn had been keeping their forbidden history alive for centuries. Yes. The humans provided weapons, training, tactical advice, and something far more powerful than any of those things. They provided proof that the Dominion could be beaten. They showed the Vryn footage of the Battle of Sol, of tiny human ships tearing apart Dominion dreadnoughts, of boarding teams fighting in corridors, of a species that had never seen an alien before and had responded to first contact with defiance rather than despair. Within a week, the Vryn were in open rebellion. Within a month, 11 more species had joined them. The Dominion was burning from the inside. High Imperator Zorath Kale stood in the war chamber and watched his empire crack like glass. World after world was slipping from his grasp, and the humans were at the center of every uprising, not conquering, not replacing one set of masters with another, but simply standing beside each rebelling species and helping them fight for themselves. "They are not building an empire," said one of his advisors, his voice thin with confusion. "They gain nothing from this. They free these worlds, and then they leave. They ask for no tribute, no territory, no resources. They simply arm the populace and move on to the next system." Kale could not understand it. And that was what frightened him most. An enemy he could not understand was an enemy he could not predict. And an enemy he could not predict was an enemy he could not defeat. In his desperation, he gave an order that had not been given in 7,000 years. He commanded the construction of the World Breaker, a weapon designed to crack a planet's core and reduce it to a field of molten debris. The weapon had been forbidden by the Dominion's own ancient laws, sealed behind codes that only the Imperator could unlock, and it existed for one purpose: to destroy a world so completely that nothing could ever grow there again. The target was Earth. Calvreth learned of the World Breaker from a frightened technician who had been assigned to the construction team and could not sleep at night. The scholar listened to the technician's trembling account of the weapon's capabilities and felt his heart go cold. It could be deployed within 3 months, launched from a hidden facility in the outer reaches of Dominion space. And there was no defense against it. Once fired, it could not be stopped. He spent 2 days in agonized silence, pacing his study and arguing with himself, because what he was considering was treason of the highest order, a crime punishable by the dissolution of his entire genetic line. And then he received a communication that made his decision for him. The humans had been trying to contact him for weeks, having identified him through intercepted Dominion communications as a scholar who had argued against the invasion. Their ambassador was a soft-spoken old man named Elias Okonkwo, and he spoke to Calvreth through an encrypted channel, with a voice that was warm and sad and impossibly kind. "We know about the weapon, scholar," Okonkwo said. "Our intelligence is not perfect, but it is good enough. We know what your Imperator is building, and we know what he intends to do with it." "Then you know you should flee," Calvreth said. "Take your ships and run to the far side of the galaxy and pray he does not follow." Okonkwo was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that Calvreth had never heard from any being in his entire life. Not grief, not anger, not fear, but a kind of gentle, unshakable certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than thought. "We have been every kind of monster, scholar. We have enslaved our own kind, burned our own world, split the atom, and pointed it at our own children. We know what empire costs, because we have paid it in our own blood. We are not here to replace your chains with ours. We are here because no one came for us when we were drowning, and we remember what that silence felt like." Calvreth closed his eyes and felt something break inside him. Not his courage, not his loyalty, but the wall he had built between what he knew was right and what he had been taught was duty. He transmitted the World Breaker schematics to Earth that night, and as the data streamed across the stars, he whispered to the empty room the same words he had spoken months ago, but this time they carried a different weight, not horror, but resolve. What have we done? But now the question was not about the Dominion's mistake. It was about his own choice to finally correct it. The combined fleet that gathered at the edge of Dominion space was the largest multi-species armada the galaxy had ever seen. 300 human warships formed the core, flanked by Vryn swarm carriers that buzzed with newly freed soldiers, Drachiel living ships that pulsed with bioluminescent fury, and dozens of vessels from species whose names the galaxy had nearly forgotten because the Dominion had tried so hard to erase them. And at the front of the formation, aboard a small and battered cruiser that bore the scars of a dozen engagements, stood General Lena Vasquez, older now, thinner, with a scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, where a piece of shrapnel had nearly taken her head during the Battle of Saul. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night since the war began, and her eyes carried the weight of every life she had spent to get to this moment. But those eyes were steady, and her voice did not waver when she opened the fleet-wide channel. "All ships, this is General Vasquez. The target is Thalkarath, the Dominion homeworld. Our objective is the World-Breaker weapon and the regime that built it. Rules of engagements are absolute, military targets only. Any ship that fires on civilians will answer to me personally. We are not here to destroy a world. We are here to free one. Is that understood?" The response came back from every ship in the fleet, in a dozen languages, a single word that needed no translation. Understood. Calvreth stood on the bridge of a Dominion defector vessel, surrounded by officers who had followed him into treason because they had looked at what their empire had become and could no longer stomach it. His hands were shaking, but he held his head high, because for the first time in his life, the fear he felt was not of consequences, but of failure. The failure to see this through to the end. The fleet jumped to FTL, and the stars stretched into lines of white fire. They arrived at Thalkarath to find the largest defensive armada ever assembled. Every warship the Dominion had left, pulled from every corner of its crumbling empire. More than 10,000 vessels arranged in a wall of metal and energy that surrounded the homeworld like a shell. Behind that shell, in a weapons platform orbiting the dark side of Thalkarath's largest moon, the Worldbreaker hummed with the power to crack a planet in half. High Imperator Zorath Kale stood in the war chamber of the Obsidian Halls and watched the Coalition fleet appear on his sensors, and he felt nothing. Not fear, not anger, not regret. He had gone past all of those things into a cold and empty place where only pride remained, and pride told him that the Dominion would not fall while he drew breath. "All ships engage and destroy," he commanded, and 10,000 warships surged forward to meet 300 human vessels and their ragged collection of allies. The Battle of Thalkarath began in silence, as all space battles do. And then the silence was shattered by the light of 10,000 weapons firing at once, and the void between the two fleets became a storm of plasma, kinetic rounds, nuclear fire, and things that had no name in any language. The Coalition was outnumbered more than 3-1, and the Dominion's home fleet was fresh and fully supplied, while the Coalition had been fighting for months. But the humans had studied every battle in their history, and they had brought those lessons with them across the stars. Vasquez split her fleet into 3 groups, just as a human admiral named Nelson had done at a place called Trafalgar centuries ago. She drove the center group straight into the heart of the Dominion formation, punching through the line and splitting it in 2, while the flanking groups swept around the edges and attacked from behind. The Dominion commanders, trained in rigid formation tactics, were thrown into confusion by a strategy that was older than their civilization. The Vryn swarm carriers released clouds of small attack craft that moved like living things, flowing around Dominion defenses and striking at weak points with a coordination that came from 9,000 years of hive mind evolution. Freed from Dominion control, the Vryn fought with a fury that surprised even themselves, as if every generation of slavery was a debt being paid in fire. The Drakeal living ships absorbed damage that would have destroyed metal vessels and kept fighting, their organic hulls regenerating even as they burned, ramming Dominion ships and wrapping around them like predators pulling down prey. And through it all, the human ships fought with the same terrifying combination of brilliance and madness that had broken the Ninth Fleet at Saul. They used the wreckage of destroyed vessels as shields. They redirected torpedoes mid-flight using improvised signal hacks. They rammed when they ran out of ammunition. And they never, not once, not for a single moment, stopped pushing forward. The battle raged for 9 hours, and the losses on both sides were staggering. Entire squadrons vanished in seconds, and the space around Thalkarath became so thick with debris that navigation was nearly impossible. Vasquez lost her flagship's main engines in the 6th hour, and transferred her command to a Vrin carrier, continuing to direct the battle without missing a single order. In the 8th hour, she led the final assault on the orbital defense grid personally, her borrowed ship burning and breaking apart around her as it dove through a wall of defensive fire that would have turned any sane commander back. And when the last defense platform exploded, the path to the planet's surface was open. Coalition ground forces landed on Thalkarath in dropships that fell through the atmosphere like meteors. Human marines alongside Vrin soldiers, Drakeel's shock troops alongside members of species that had not set foot on free soil in millennia. They moved through the ancient cities of the Dominion with speed and precision, securing government buildings, disabling military installations, and everywhere they went, they followed the same order: do not harm civilians. The Thalkarath citizens watched in bewildered silence as alien soldiers, led by the small, soft-bodied humans they had been told were primitive animals, moved through their streets without looting, without burning, without the casual cruelty that the Dominion had always inflicted on conquered peoples. Human medics treated wounded Dominion soldiers alongside their own, and when a group of terrified Thalkarath children were found hiding in a collapsed building, it was a human sergeant who carried them to safety one by one, speaking softly in a language they could not understand, but in a tone that needed no translation. Kale retreated to the obsidian halls as the city around him fell, not in flames, but in something far more devastating to a tyrant: quiet, almost gentle surrender. The people he had ruled were not rising to defend him, because they had realized, watching the Coalition's mercy, that they had never truly been protected by him. They had been imprisoned. He descended the ancient stairs to the oracle chamber one final time, and the crystalline being pulsed with soft blue light as he entered. Not the red of warning, not the amber of caution, but blue, calm, patient, almost tender. "Why?" Kale demanded, his voice cracking for the first time in his reign. "You could have shown me. You could have made me see what they were. Why did you only give me riddles?" The oracle was silent for a long moment, and then it spoke in a voice that was quieter than Kale had ever heard it use. "I did not warn you because I feared them, Imperator. I warned you because I feared what you would make them become. The two-legged storm does not begin in fury. It begins in grief. You struck first. You taught a species of poets and dreamers that the universe is as cruel as the world they crawled out of. And when humans learn that lesson, they do not weep. They sharpen." Kale sank to his knees on the ancient stone floor, and the last High Imperator of the Dominion of Thalkarath was taken alive by a squad of human marines who entered the chamber with weapons raised, but did not fire, because their orders were clear, and because the small broken figure kneeling before the glowing crystal was no longer a threat to anyone. 3 days later, Ambassador Elias Okonkwo stood before the first Galactic Assembly ever held. Representatives of every free species gathered in the great hall of a world that had once been the seat of tyranny. He was old and tired, and he leaned on a cane that he had carried since a childhood illness on a planet that now felt very far away. But his voice was clear and strong. "We were warned once that the stars were cold and empty and hostile. We were warned that the universe does not care. Maybe that is true, but we have decided to care anyway. Not because we are strong, but because we know what it is like to be weak. Every species in this room has suffered. Every species has bled. That suffering is not your shame. It is your credentials. You have earned the right to build something better, and we will build it together or not at all." The hall was silent for a moment, And then a sound began. Not applause, not cheering, but something deeper. A low hum from the Vrin, a deep resonance from the Drakeel, a clicking from species whose names the galaxy was only now relearning. Each culture's expression of agreement, of solidarity, rising together into a harmony that had never existed before. And far away, in the chamber beneath the obsidian halls, the Oracle watched through a live feed, and after 12,000 years of guiding, warning, predicting, and watching civilizations rise and fall and rise again, the ancient being processed what it was seeing, and its crystalline form flickered with colors it had never produced before. Soft greens and golds, and a deep warm violet that no Falkarath eye had ever witnessed. It spoke its final recorded words before entering a voluntary silence that would last for centuries. I have watched civilizations rise for 12,000 years. I have never once been hopeful. I am recalculating. And across the galaxy, on 100 worlds that were learning to breathe free air for the first time, the two-legged storm settled, not into silence, not into sleep, but into something far more powerful than fury, into purpose. The stars were no longer cold. Someone had decided to care.